Well, thank you so much for joining me. It is such a pleasure to get to speak with you today. I'm here today with Jane Morba. Is that how you say your last name, Morba? So, just to get started, I want to just express that my intention in wanting to speak with you today is to honor, elevate, and amplify deaf culture as a culture rather than as a disability. And you and I have had a couple chances to chat before. And so we've talked about this a little bit. And I want to be really careful to kind of walk that line between educating people, but also not turning you into some sort of a token to be the educator of all. And my hope is that people who are listening to this will go and do their own research and do their own learning in terms of what deaf culture is and is not. But we specifically, because of course my emphasis and my focus in my own life and work is on the voice. I specifically would like to talk with you today about this concept of voice and what voice means in deaf culture. So, what I'd really like to start with, however, is just talking about you. You are a child of two deaf parents, and I'd like to talk a bit about how you were raised and um, specifically how your parents instilled in you and your siblings a sense of pride in being part of deaf culture, and maybe also just kind of how they were raised and how that might have evolved over time. So your parents, kind of in the era that they were raised into raising you and your siblings, kind of what your experience was of that, and what you can share with us about your kind of self identity or identity of being within the hearing culture, but also in deaf culture as well, wherever you'd like to start with that.
Okay, that sounds like perfect place to start, and it sounds like you're really honoring and giving space to the deaf culture, which I love. And I think maybe you found the right person to talk to about this. And I think um, from my experience of growing up in deaf culture, and I'm a CODA, which is an acronym for Children of Deaf Adults. If people don't know, it's CODA. And there's a whole kind of culture and movement and conferences on for CODAs now. But from my growing up, there was a lot of pride in deaf culture. And I just want to say, like, deafness is a culture. It's a physicality, it's an aesthetic, it's a language, it's an intimacy like no other language, I think, on the planet. And the more I kind of reflect on it and look at it, I feel that there's a lot of gratitude, and I feel very fortunate to have been in this position to grow up and see firsthand what deaf culture is for me and for others. Um, the deafness is it's based on your audible level of hearing, and then there's deafness in culture, which is based on honoring the language and the cultural itself. So some people can be deaf and they totally embrace the culture. Some people are not deaf and they totally embrace the culture. So I'll just start with that type of foundation. And
Let's
okay.
um let's kind of distinguish for people who may not understand what we're talking about when we talk about deaf culture. As you know, I'm a speech pathologist. I'm trained as a speech pathologist, and that's not always a popular thing to be within deaf culture because there's a
Mm,
long history of people in the hearing world trying to force people in the who were born without hearing to be part of hearing culture, which for somebody who's born deaf is a very, very unnatural thing to be and do. And so, in some sense, some of it bordered on or probably crossed the line into abuse of deaf children in trying to force them into a mold that just didn't fit. And so, within kind of predominant hearing culture, deafness can be thought of as a disability. So what we're talking about when we're talking about deaf culture is a reclamation, a reclaiming of the self as intact, as fully whole, and as culturally different, but not in any way disabled. So can you speak to that a bit when you
mm.
talk about sort of the pride that you felt growing up in a family and within deaf culture?
Sure. My mother primarily went to deaf school. She went to the Trenton School for the Deaf, which was on the Delaware Water Gap. It was a beautiful campus. It's kind of like a boarding school. And in those days, there were many of these type of schools up in Connecticut, I think in many states, and Pennsylvania, for instance, where she met my father, who was at a deaf school as well. And there was a lots of pride, and they would learn sign language, and they were really supported in their whole language of, American Sign Language and signing. So when I grew up, there was a lot of pride. We embraced the culture. We never swayed from it. I was probably from, that generation and my siblings where not all of my parents' friends or not all of our, friends kids. I'll just speak for myself. We grew up signing. That was my primary. I was bilingual. I grew up signing. I was probably even a late speaker because I learned to sign, and I use that was like, my two languages. And we were so proud of it. And my mother, the language evolved over time because ASL got more sophisticated and so forth. But there were other, maybe my mother's friends' children, they were more oral. So they would kind of, and that had to do also with the parents, the grandparents, how they felt about sign language or deafness, or if they were proud, or if they were just not embracing it, like a disability, like you said. So that was my perspective, which was kind of exciting for me because it was a physicality, it was an intimacy. It was like my mother was also very social, so there were deaf clubs, and we would go to deaf clubs and speak in sign language and the deaf culture. So I think it was a beautiful experience. There are other things that we'll talk about, when you're a young child. It puts a little pressure on children because you are interpreting for your deaf parents and all different type of situations. And there's a dignity you want to give the deaf people. So I always felt I was on the side of always giving information and dignity to the deaf culture and not, and as time went on, the deaf schools were not so popular. People were integrating deafness into hearing schools. And then the cochlear implants would come because the technology will probably get there. But I love that you brought up so how that yeah, people didn't understand. And as speech pathologists, um, deaf people were almost kind of forced to be in the hearing world. Now that's the problem because they're in their own world. And I felt like I was a bridge between that. I was a bridge between bridging my mother and educating her on what deaf world or what we're talking about and integrating that. And then going back into the deaf world with all her friends and communicating with this, like I said, physicality, intimacy, the physical, the beauty of it, which I'm like using my hands right now. Yeah. It's like the mother, father, it's that type of deafness that we really embrace. So that's why I said it in the beginning. I think maybe you got the right person to speak to because I really was part of this beautiful culture, um, and dance. And I feel fortunate about that.
Yeah, of
But
course. And like I mentioned, I was trained as a speech pathologist, but I went to a graduate school that very much, it was interesting because cochlear implants were kind of new-ish at the time when I was studying in
yeah,
graduate school. And I went to a state school that had a medical university hospital. And so the idea of doing research in cochlear implants was huge on the one hand. And on the other hand, the ethics and integrity and understanding and responsibility of diversity was also huge. And so the understanding of, I got sort of simultaneous education in the research and science of cochlear implants, and also that the flip side of that was that within deaf culture, cochlear implants for many people within deaf culture, and I'm talking about deaf culture with a capital D, not just deafness as a proposed symptom or something that's
Mhm.
different from hearing. Cochlear implants were because cochlear implants had to be um, surgically implanted young, like by 18 months or so. There were a lot of people in the deaf culture who saw that as literal child abuse. And so it was a very big, hot topic when I was in graduate school in terms of, are cochlear implants even ethical? Are they even, are we really torturing or abusing a child who has an alternative mode of communication? It's not that they will be isolated from culture, they'll be isolated from hearing culture. And from there, that sort of perspective, you said you're kind of the perfect person for me to talk about this with. And I believe that you are. And part of that is that I have been wanting for 20 years to have this conversation because
Mhm.
for me, deafness as a culture is very, very significant in my heart. It's very important to me. And everything I do is in voice and hearing. And so the question of how do I honor deafness when everything I do has to do with sound and voice has been sort of troubling me for many, many, many years. So
Wow.
I'd like to ask you, since you're so gracious and willing to talk to me about it, what does it mean to have a voice in deaf culture? And by that I mean, how would you describe the voice of the deaf community in terms of visibility, in terms of the sense of being heard or honored or respected, treated as an empowered member of the community at large? In other words, do people within deaf culture, do they feel or perceive that they have a voice in the broader community of hearing culture?
I think they do, and I think they have become empowered within their own culture. Yes, on the other hand, they can be very frustrated. They aren't being recognized or seen or communicated with, or they might be dismissed. And that can be very troubling. And that comes with more advocation laws that really support the deaf community, but do they have a voice? I think it's like going down a rabbit hole and opening up a Pandora box. Like it would probably be a big study. Maybe Gallaudet has a study on this, or there's a thesis, but I hear you very well because even though I have been very honoring and protective and have a lot of dignity, and I think I was raised with embracing deaf culture, really hands on deck, maybe other people and maybe even different socioeconomic levels can really affect that too. So do they have a voice? Yeah, they're very expressive. They're very expressive when their own, when we're socializing in the deaf community, people have personalities that are huge, like the comedian, the compassionate soul. Like everybody I feel really represents who they are very freely in the deaf community. But it might not be seen in the world. But I think more and more when I see deaf people around, they are fully expressive, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think their voice is their language, their ASL, like again, their space, their intimacy, and trying to get people to understand with more empathy, that they have human rights. They are, it's not a disability. It's just a different level of culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a
But I think
difference.
it, but I would have to go down and look at that more closely. They don't want look at it as a disability. It's who they are. Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In terms of the English spoken word for voice or the auditory word for voice or that concept of kind of
Mm.
vibration coming on air through the mouth as sound, um, how does your signed language is American Sign Language, and as some people know, American Sign Language is not the only kind of sign language. There are other ways to sign, so it's one particular language that people can use as a visual mode of communication. Is there a sign for voice in ASL?
Voice is this. Yeah. Yeah.
And do you
Mm.
feel like the concept of that sign in sign language is different from how we use voice in hearing culture?
I, yeah, well, I mean, we have this, our voice, right? We have this tonality, the, the texture, and the deaf people can't, since they're not hearing,
Hmm.
the sound comes out different. It
Okay.
comes out not, even though there's sometimes education in deaf culture trying to get the sound
Hmm.
bridged a little closer. Um, but they tend not to maybe use the voice, or some deaf people use the voice, so
Hmm.
it sounds really different in the world, and that's what makes it really unique. And I hear a lot of, even when we sing birthday parties, you you hear, like, singing birthday parties, but it sounds really different.
Aha.
Yes. Mm. And
Singing birthday
yeah,
parties, you mean singing happy birthday
birthday, yeah,
in
singing
sign
happy.
language?
Yeah, or even using the voice,
Oh,
like
I see.
even,
Hmm.
yeah, it sounds very different. So there might be, I think, when you studied, did you have education for the deaf? Like, was there any type of helping deaf people sound out words a little bit more in English or anything like that?
Well, because I was in the speech pathology side and not in the audiology side, I think the
Yeah,
audiology side may have had more within what they would call rehabilitative audiology for children,
that's
where,
it.
right,
Yeah.
where the
Mm,
idea was, again, that the normative thing is to be hearing. And so if you're not hearing, you're rehabilitating the
yeah.
language. So again, it's all very, very fraught,
Hmm.
the whole conversation. And again, I really appreciate your grace in having the conversation because I know just having the conversation is fraught. It can be very fraught.
Yes, I think even when we spoke before, it was even more emotional for me. But like the more, my mother just passed, so we
Mm-hmm.
just had a service, and um, there were deaf people there, and we had an interpreter. Like, we would never think not to have an interpreter
Mm-hmm.
for any event when m- when we had, family events, in bridging the deaf world with the hearing world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that was dignity. That was what we would do most of my life growing up, actually.
And is
So,
there in such a memorial, is there music and singing? Does that have a place within deaf culture? Because I know there's plenty of art in deaf culture. There's
yeah,
dance.
yes.
There are absolutely deaf folks who are musicians, and who they just do music again differently.
Yes, we actually didn't have any music
Mm-hmm.
for we weren't, we didn't even have any music, but we had more talking and speeches, and but you're right. There's so much sign language now with sports events and interpreters for singing, and now it's kind of chic, it's kind of cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there've been Oscar winning, deaf actresses, and deaf deaf I think there are deaf characters in many different series now,
Mm-hmm.
so it has been a little bit more cool, are part of culture. And now we can see the integration as well. But I think um, there's like a level of, for me, a certain responsibility to always use sign language when at all possible, when I'm around deaf people. and integrate as much as possible. But like the cochlear implants, yeah, that is a hot topic because people feel like it's invasive. It's taking away culture, and that's a big topic.
And
Yeah.
also that it's an unnecessary intervention because, in other words, unless we're assuming that hearing is normal and deafness is not, there's
Mm,
people within deaf culture can still communicate. They have a means to communicate. And within, language development, we now have enough research to know that it doesn't really matter what language you learn, as long as you
mm,
get continual input of language, whether that is signed or Japanese
that's
or English or French, it doesn't matter as long as your input is consistent and
yeah.
your brain is able to take it in. Your brain is wired such that it will receive language. It doesn't matter if that language is signed or not. And so then if you can sign language to a baby that is not hearing, and you figure out quickly enough that that baby is not hearing, and you get them the language input that they need, it doesn't
Mm,
matter if they're signing or speaking, they will learn language and, in theory, be able to live a full life without ever speaking. So, why cut into their brain? Why perform a
mm,
surgery on a baby unless you are trying to normalize that child so they fit in with mainstream culture? And
yeah.
mainstream culture often doesn't understand that it's a lot of people feel that it is an unnecessary and an unnecessarily invasive destruction of a child, of a very small baby.
Yeah, it's true. I'm sure there's lots of rules and legality circulating around it, but yeah, there were people even in our community that had done the cochlear implant, and my mother was teaching them sign language, but that was the path they wanted to go,
Hmm.
and with the technology, it kind of, presents a whole nother
It does,
option, but there definitely emotional feelings about it as well.
for
Yeah,
sure, for
culture.
sure.
Yeah. Mm,
How
mm.
would you say you perceive your voice in ASL as compared with your voice in spoken English?
Well, it's interesting because I'm a fairly quiet person, more of an introvert. I mean, at times I'm an extrovert, but I think kind of silently because it's interesting. I think silently, and I'd have to force myself to hear myself verbally if I was, practicing something. So like I I I think in both. Like when I sometimes I'm spelling out words, I will sign it out to think of it. So that bilingual comes in, and but I think my voice, I have to work harder at saying, "Oh, can I really hear my voice? What am I projecting in my voice?" But I think there's a certain intimacy with space and American Sign Language that I tend to be mindful of the voice and the space.
Ah,
So, yeah.
that's really
Mm,
interesting.
mm.
Would you say that you feel more or less empowered, more or less authentic, more or less real, more or less kind, more or less angry in one language or another?
Ah, I think I could be more or less kind in I can be a little bit more kind in ASL,
Hmm.
but it can be quite fun and expressive to use ASL in a real like chaotic way. You know, you know, I've seen many deaf people get mad in
Oh,
their
sure.
language, and it's a cool thing, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm,
That is interesting because you talk about that sense of space. And
mm,
so you talk about that sense of space and of intimacy. And
yeah,
so I would imagine, I mean, there in spoken language, there's also this sense
yeah.
distance between you and your conversational partner and where it's appropriate and where it isn't. But I imagine that that sense of space translates into voice more when you are in the space of signing than it does when you're in the space of speaking. Does it?
Yeah, I think so. When you're in the space of signing, you have to like kind of you want to contain the space because it's about space. It's about your hands, it's about the level, it's about the expression on the face.
Mm-hmm.
That is such a huge part of ASL. How people's expressions are. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they angry? And I don't know if we're doing that enough in
In spoken
speaking.
English.
In
Mm-hmm.
spoken English. I can't
Yeah.
come.
Yep.
Yeah. The word is spoken English. I don't know. I mean, unless you're really working at fully speaking holistically.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people aren't actually. I think we're kind of like we're not fully speaking. I think you need to like take some class. People maybe who are entrepreneurs or thought leaders or podcasters. Maybe we're working on that a little bit more. But if you want to improve communication, a lot of it has to do with eye contact, expression
Mm.
of the face, and things like that. I'm actually quite interested in that. Um, just overall, maybe it's because I come from a deaf background, deaf culture. I'm into language. I I feel like, I could push myself to integrate the spoken word with the physicality. I feel like it's kind of dazzling to me in a way.
Absolutely. And so
Yeah.
much of the work that I do in voice has to do with that holistic sense of the embodiment of the voice. And in sign language, that is inherent to the language itself. You are embodying the language fully. I mean, the whole language has to come through the body. And
Mm.
so, this idea that the voice comes through the body, I think for some people is kind of an abstract concept that, well, we
Yeah.
breathe into the lungs and then the lungs push air out through the vocal folds and they vibrate. I mean, it's all embodied. But I think a
Mm.
lot of people think, oh, well, I think and then I just speak. And they don't really, they think all of it is just thoughts coming out and they don't
Yeah.
recognize the holistic embodiment. But I imagine that in ASL, in the language itself, because it's so embodied, that has to have an effect on the culture and how expression manifests through the voice, what we're calling the voice in signed language.
Yes. And I think it's since it has more expression and it relies on that. That's why I think it's so beautiful. And that's why
Mm.
people do say, oh, sign language is so beautiful. Oh, how do you do that? How do you sign that? Oh, I wish I could learn that. I think we talked about this.
Yeah.
And then when people say, oh, I wish I could learn it. Oh, I learned a few words in high school. And I'm always like perplexed. Like, you can't just keep learning.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much material out there to learn more. Why don't we do that? So I love that well, that's just my own pet peeve. I get annoyed when people say, oh, out in the world with my mother, um, oh, I learned a few words. Well, there's YouTube and, there's plenty of opportunities to keep expressing and learning, but that's a whole nother story. But
Well,
because
it
I've
is
experienced that so much
right.
growing, I experienced it so much. I feel like, I feel resentful of people. Are you not like, are we so lazy we can't learn what other people are experiencing? And that's what kind of annoys me sometimes. Can people just be more open-minded and learn, be curious? Can we just be curious?
Well,
Yeah.
I think some people are genuinely, well, I guess the question is, do you think that people within deaf culture are either intentionally or unintentionally isolated, invisibilized? In other words, I don't often, when I'm out in public, see people signing. And I
Mm.
often wonder, where are the people who are signing? Where are they? Are they mostly are they a subculture that kind of sticks within their own spaces and doesn't, or do they have areas, like I'm Arab, so we definitely, I am part of a subculture that, well,
Yeah.
we may go here and not there, and you aren't always going to hear me speak Arabic unless I'm in a certain um, place or with a certain group of people. But
Yeah.
I think to your point that a lot of people, it's like they invisibilize deaf culture because when they visually see them, they don't see any difference unless they see them
Hmm.
signing. And then if they do see them signing, they don't take that as an invitation to then say, oh, here's a part of my community and a part of the broader culture. And I know nothing about this group of people, and I should go learn some of their language. I just think it does not occur to people because to hearing
Mm.
people, because I think
Yeah.
that they are so removed from it that they just think, oh, well, this person's passing by. And they don't even necessarily know that somebody within deaf culture would appreciate it if somebody in hearing culture learned their language. But who wouldn't appreciate it if somebody goes out and learns their language? Everybody appreciates
Right.
that. So,
That's true.
can you
Yeah.
speak to that a bit? Because I think that is, you speak to it with such passion. And I love that so much because I don't think that that is an assumed thing. I don't know that people necessarily think they're welcome within another person's
Mm.
culture. I don't necessarily know that people know if they're wanted within another person's culture. So, can you talk about that a little bit as you were growing up and sort of being in spaces with your parents or kind of even with your siblings to a degree? What was your experience of that, what you call a pet peeve of don't
Mm.
be so lazy, you should learn more? How did that manifest for you or come up, or how would it have translated in a better way?
Yeah, maybe in a better way if I was more aware of myself at that time, of
Mm.
what I wanted the deaf culture to be in the hearing world, like maybe an invitation to people, or maybe have taught people or give them a resource. I mean, it's not anyone else's responsibility to maybe learn deaf culture or deaf, American Sign Language unless they were part of the family, but not even but people part of the family would really take an initiative to do that. So, um, but out in the community, I wish people would embrace it more, but I don't know how I would have been if I did not have, deafness as a prominent part of my being and my DNA.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would have embraced it, but I wish people would
Hmm.
embrace it a little bit more and not be so, it's so odd or something. But like we said, I think it's improving. People are becoming more aware. There are much more visual signs than there were maybe in the 70s and 80s. I grew up in New Jersey. I can just think back ago being in Newark Airport and there were hardly any signs. There's no signage. Like now there's clarity and signage. Like we've evolved so much um uh in that regard. But getting back to and I think that bridges the gap between embracing people with different languages or
Hmm.
visibility, and integrating different diversity in different cultures. So I do wish people would embrace it more or be more curious.
Well, and
Mm.
I think that is true across the board. I mean, wouldn't it be such a different world if every single one of us, when we met somebody who was different from us, got
Yeah.
curious and said, "Oh my gosh, I am so ignorant of
Mm.
that aspect of humanity, and I want to know. I want to learn. I want to." And I think people are afraid to cross boundaries. I think people are afraid to insult
Yeah.
people, and there's all of that.
Yes, I do
So,
think that occurs. Yeah, like even for deaf people are around. I've had talks about this with people. Do you go in and just say, "Hi, I'm introducing myself. I know sign language too," or do you keep boundaries?
yeah.
Maybe we need to, like you said, maybe we need to be more curious and bridge a boundary, like you're Arab, like, oh, get more curious about the Arab culture or a few ways to communicate, And I think maybe that's where we're headed.
I think
Maybe
so
that can be
too.
where we're headed. Yeah, do you think so? And I
I
think
think it needs
is
to
that
be.
yeah. Mm,
But I do think
yeah.
that there, in your experience, what were the things when you were, say, out in public? So when you were, it sounds like when you were in your own family environment, things were pretty just open and flowing. I think you described maybe that there were some relatives that could have learned sign language and maybe didn't,
And
um,
some that did, and
and
some
some
that
that
did.
did,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
meaningful, right?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
what would you have hoped might have been different when you were growing up, or
Yeah. Since I was learned the sign language, since I learned sign language, and my siblings did, we were tend to have been the interpreters, the bridge between the hearing world and the deaf world. And there were moments when maybe my nieces' girlfriends learned a few words and they wanted to really integrate with my mother. And I think that I've heard stories of that, and that was really endearing. And one of my cousins learned sign language with their partner, and I really appreciated that. It's just very touching
Mhm.
to have that experience, and people really wanted to, be present, take a pause, learn, be curious. So since I was the interpreter, I felt like people relied on us as the interpreter.
Mm.
Oh, okay, we'll be the interpreters. Okay, so I'll tell you what they said. I'll share what the hearing said and what the deaf said, and then it ended up being defaulted to, okay, I don't have to really learn anything or try hard. Their kids will be there and they'll interpret. So that became like an emotional baggage after a while. Because when you're young, taking on the certain amount of responsibility and, tasks that maybe, you're not so ready for. So there can be some resentment, and, sometimes I'd be like, oh, I don't want to interpret. But I seem to have really cared, I did care, and I wanted my parents to have the dignity and the inclusiveness. So that was the banner and the flag and the light I held.
Mm.
And I think many CODAs do. You feel the certain sense of responsibility of bridging your deaf parents into the hearing world, and so that's
forth.
why I wish there was more integration, but then we go back into the deaf world where we can all sign together, and so I felt very joyful sometimes in the deaf world because
Hmm.
there wasn't this oddness or what are they saying, interpreting because we are all speaking the same language actually.
Right.
Yeah. But I
What
mean, we're talking about the intimate world and then the outer world. So there's two different worlds, right? Mhm.
Right, there can be, right? And that does sound like a lot of not only pressure to put on a child in sort of a socio-emotional sense, but
Yeah.
just literally neurologically, that must be exhausting for the brain to just be
Mm.
having to interpret and translate all the time. It's tiring work. And I know people
Yeah.
who are interpreters of sign language or other translators of other languages who are just, it's tiring. It's very, very exhausting
Yeah.
neurologically in terms of what the brain is having to do.
That is a good point. I mean, people would say, how come you don't interpret as a profession? Because
Mm.
interpreters do make a lot of money. And I said, I was exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think my brain could have handled it. I didn't want to make that my whole life's work. When some people did,
Sure.
some people are real, it just flowed for them, but I didn't want to. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's exhausting neurologically. Yeah, good point.
that makes sense. It
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. So what does or should inclusivity look like when deaf people are involved in hearing contexts? What do you want to see? What should include, you mentioned the word inclusivity a moment ago. What should inclusivity, or what would you like it to look like?
Well, one part of the that the deaf world had provided me is a certain kind of worldliness because there is sign language in every different culture. And my mother was father were they were into they had deaf friends from different parts of the world. It's a small community. So they might have, I think my mother had some friends in different cultures. So there's deaf sign that's different, unbelievably enough, in Germany to England, I'm not England, Spain or so,
Hmm.
or Australian are different symbols. So I think to have a little bit more of a cultural umbrella,
Mm.
that there's a bit more honoring of the deafness, even on my part, sometimes I post videos and say on Facebook or something, and I have deaf people on my feed, and sometimes the closed captions didn't take, or
Hmm.
it's technology, and they remind me your closed captions not working, like keep us in, I want to be included in everything. And that really touched me, like it really kind of bummed me out a little bit that I wasn't inclusive. I feel like there's a certain responsibility. So what can I do more is there's almost like a two different parts of me, doing videos or some or so forth that's inclusive just of deaf world,
Hmm.
and or maybe doing videos to the hearing world and integrating the deafness, integrating signs. And I think we spoke about that.
Hmm.
Like it's not, it's almost like embracing it all.
Hmm.
And I think I've in the past have just said, I'm in the hearing world. I'm speaking like into the hearing world, but I have to somehow bridge the gap. So I hope that I would embrace more of my deaf culture experience. That's what I hope in some way, in some artistic way. Yeah.
That is, you bring up something that I think is really important because I think for people who are living in the hearing world and taking that as assumed, this closed captioned idea is not front of mind. And I've
Yeah.
noticed it now that my father's hearing has become, my father's become profoundly deaf as he's aged.
Wow.
And so I'm very aware of, when I'm with him, just how much we assume
Mm,
in the hearing world about what is normal, what video is, what the visual world is. What is that like for a deaf person? Um, and to whatever degree you can speak to it, but what is that like, would you say, for a deaf person to be in the world where people are constantly neglecting, oh, shoot, there might be somebody you can't hear. I should do something about that. I should act. I should be aware. I should care. What is
mm,
that like? You just described sort of your friend saying, hey, your closed captions aren't on. And that,
yes.
for somebody like you who's aware of it, it was just an oversight or the tech wasn't working or whatever. But for
Hmm.
somebody who lives in the hearing world, people need to be told, turn on the captions. Or if you have an
Yes.
event, hire an interpreter or just be aware of who's in your audience and in your surroundings. What is that like? What does that do to somebody when they are excluded in that way?
Oh, yeah. It's elitist, it's elitist. It makes you feel like your culture's more important.
Mm.
And you almost do have to think about your audience and say, okay, if there's a few deaf people here, they need to be able to see this option and see the words equally as well. So in a way, we got to slow down.
Mm.
Unless your audience is all hearing and, maybe you're doing something that's in that way, but it should be in maybe something I need to look at too, like a little bridge, another video or something that really caters to
Hmm.
that culture in some creative way. And now you're making me think about that. I mean, now with video, obviously, I think the studies reveal that most people, if they're scrolling or watching video on social media, they are have the sound off and they're
Mm-hmm.
looking at mostly words, right?
Yep.
You've heard this, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what does this reveal? This reveals that this is kind of prominent,
Mm.
right? And so words, I mean, the captions and all this beautiful caption and design can be enhanced, more fluid, maybe blended chaotically or lyrically. I've studied some Gabriel Roth dance in my
Mm.
days in
Mm-hmm.
California, so there's all those different rhythms, and maybe that can also be infused in captions as well. So such a beautiful topic. Like, and now I'm thinking creatively, how exciting and beautiful that could be, and honoring of my deaf culture, and to not just get things out there fast. So I think a lot of graphics, moving graphics are really exciting now. And I think the deaf would really enjoy that as well. So it's not
Yeah.
all sound, I know people, music is a big part of culture. And I always hear, music bridges us. But since I come from a hearing world, I don't believe that. I think expression and heart and captions bridge us. But, I know there's a big affinity and longing for music. But deaf people like to dance, deaf people like to feel the music as well. But I think to answer the question is integrating really a high level of caption now with the technology can really be in a nice infused, um, you know, gateway right now to honor the deaf, right? Mm.
Well, and just an awareness of, again, differences of ability. I live in Tucson, and there's a canyon that is a popular hiking spot. And I remember years ago, I was hiking in this canyon with a friend of mine, and the canyon has these shuttles that go up and down, and now they're electric. At the time, though, they were gas, and they were smoky and smelly, and they really took up a lot of the roadway, and they were just kind of a nuisance. And my friend said, they should just outlaw these shuttles and not allow shuttles to go up and down this road because they're such a nuisance. And I said, what about people who can't walk? What about,
Yeah.
people who are either in wheelchairs or elder, or how would they get to
Hmm.
enjoy this beauty? And this friend just sort of looked at me like, well, who cares? I mean, then if you can't walk, then don't hike. Or, if you can't, then you just don't go. And I think
Mm.
that he's no longer my friend, by the way. But I think that I think that sort of that presumptive, well, these activities are for this kind of people. Like you said, it's elitist. These
Mm.
activities are for this kind of person. And if you're not that kind of person, do something else. The rest of the
Mm.
world's available to you. Don't do this. And so I think that in terms of accessibility and in terms of just basic kindness, basic awareness that not everybody in the world is like you. And
Yeah.
it doesn't take that much from you to be aware of what it takes to accommodate somebody who's different from you as a sign of respect and
Yeah.
acknowledgement of this person deserves to see beauty too. This person deserves to have access to.
Yeah.
I don't know what it takes to get human beings kind of awake to that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big topic. It's a beautiful one because it is. It's like a certain selfishness, being self-centered without being curious again about how to accommodate other people, slowing down and, embracing people with different languages, which now is so prominent now. And um, I think this is a good topic in a way. We need to have more empathy and compassion in the world. It's getting pretty intensely busy with so many cultures close together, right?
It's true.
Like even like many times and there's a law, I think, public places, when you have a TV, you're supposed to have the closed caption on. And don't get me wrong, I have to make sure I got that law right. But I think that's the truth. If you might, maybe you know. And Many times I go into public places or a doctor's office or a restaurant and the closed captions are not on. And I will most of the time say, can you put on the closed caption? And they're usually in the middle of doing service. So they or
Mm.
office work and they just don't know how to do. Oh, I don't know. I don't know how to put on closed caption. But I tend to be a hold the banner and hold the fire and flame for that because that's most of the time the sound is off. So why wouldn't you have the closed caption on? So I think I still have to work on that. I still have to fight for that, no
Hmm.
matter, you know, what on the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And we may have already touched upon this, but I want to ask you how you feel differently attuned when you're communicating with a hearing person versus when you're communicating with a deaf person. In terms of, again, you've talked a little bit about space and intimacy and kind of how all of that fits together. Space, time, talked about slowing down, slowing time down, that sort of thing. How would you say you express and perceive your voice and the voices of others through sign language versus ASL?
Mhm. It's using ASL as a voice, really. It's, you know, just as much as I would say what I was saying. It's the intensity of the eye contact, the presence, the, really listening to what they're communicating and making sure I understood them
Mm-hmm.
and, circulating the conversation no matter what. I think in I tend to be more present, I think, because it's more of visual language, how your eyes are, your facial expressions. People know when you're not present. And I think in the hearing world, language can be very, well, it depends on the circumstance, right? Work, casual,
Mm-hmm.
family or whatever, right? Okay, I'll understand that. But are we present enough in even verbally with people? I don't think we are. I think we can be somewhat lazy. People yelling. It still shocks me when I'm in a store, which kind of can be annoying, and people are like yelling, like, you know, calling, yelling because they got that opportunity, but it's not really present. It's
Mm.
yeah, it's just I pick up on things because I have an attunement that's a little bit more visual, I guess. I'm attuned to some of that brassy, talking, but that's what makes the world go round, I guess. Everybody has their own style of
Mm.
communicating.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like with the deaf world, I tend to be more present, will communicate, listen, um, think of my signs, bring my body into it. Would I do that verbally with, English or so? Mm, I don't know.
Interesting.
Mhm.
If there were something or things that you would want the hearing community to hear that
Mhm.
perhaps they have not been listening to or for, what do you want the hearing community to hear
About the deaf world or
about the deaf
just,
world, about the
mm,
concept of voice and silence in deaf culture?
yeah, I do feel like the hearing world, I invite the hearing world to generally listen and be silent sometimes. Where
Mm.
I feel like the deaf world can be silent. We don't need to have sound. I grew up not needing to have sound to fill up the space. Where the hearing world, I feel like they need to fill up the space. They need to talk every minute. They like I wish the hearing world can realize there's a beauty in the deaf world where you can actually pause, listen, slow down, and you don't have to fill up everything between your ears all the time. So that would be my gift to to the hearing world.
That is
Yeah.
really beautiful. And that again, that image of silence, and like you said, that there's like a lack of awareness of a just making noise to make noise,
Yeah.
and a
Yeah.
lack of awareness of how that noise not only fills the atmosphere and in the environment, but just is filling other people's ears, and
Yeah.
that sense that it can be like an affront. It can be not. Sometimes it can be quite violent, even if it's not intended to be. But just the
Mm,
constant barrage of noise. So this idea of really honoring silence and honoring just being is such a beautiful image to sort of take away as somebody who can hear, that you don't
mhm.
always have to be actively listening for sound or wanting that input. And it really can be exhausting. It can be exhausting to constantly let, whether it's visual input or any kind of input into the body through the senses, can be a lot. It can be overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree. I am with you on that. I find that the world is a little too assaulting and noisy.
Hmm.
And even public places, the music is so loud. It's, and it might come with my age as well, you know, in midlife, it does assault me. And I have to be really careful, like what kind of sound is in a place. You know, maybe that's why, like, you know, a little bit more sophisticated spaces, it's not so assaulting, but it is. There's too much input going on. And I think
Yes.
I've asked once my father, like, if you came back in a different life, would you be hearing or deaf? He said, I would be deaf. And I thought it was very revealing. And he's just so honored that who he was. He was deaf. It was kind of makes me cry. It was beautiful. He never said, I want to hear what you all are hearing. He was like, no, and he was a more of a earthy guy and he liked nature and was like an outdoorsy guy. But I thought that was really revealing.
Did he share any more details as to why he didn't want the experience of hearing? Did he think it would separate him somehow from like reality or the core essence of things?
Yeah, you know, I didn't delve deeper, and I maybe was just afraid to dive deeper or
Hmm.
say maybe I can't remember
Or
if
to
I said
challenge or,
why
yeah,
or
question why.
challenge it, but I just honored it, and I just you know, because he shaded that silence, you know.
That is so
Yeah, he
beautiful.
didn't feel like he missed out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
that's pretty
incredible.
powerful.
Very powerful and very
Mm.
important. Again, that is very important to recognize given the sort of beginning of where we started this conversation in terms
Yeah,
of whether it's a
yes.
difference or a culture or a disability and
Yes,
and
they didn't feel like it's a disability, it was the culture.
the beautiful
And
thing.
I felt like coming back to the beginning, full circle, is I really feel very honored this experience of being in the deaf world. It was physical, aesthetic, worldly. I felt unique in this whole upbringing. I can kind of cry now that I'm like separated from it in my midlife. I go, wow, yeah, I want to embrace it a bit more creatively. And we
Mm,
talked about the creative visuals, and I was a photographer, you know, my past life. You know, this would be an opportunity for me to explore that, you know, some of the creative levels and maybe look at video, which I like to make video with the embracing of captions and aesthetic and the five rhythms of Gabriel Roth, like in there, you know, as an artist for the
yeah.
deaf community. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also there's this idea of, like you said, sort of this music centered, voice centered,
Mm,
sound centered. And so when we talk about inclusivity, we're often talking about how do I help the deaf community to share or be included in my experience? And so if we're talking
yeah.
about art, if we're talking about closed captions, it's you're missing out on this, so I'm going to help you be in on it. That's one aspect. It's one aspect that I think is good to make available. But then there's this other question of what is art? And again, what is art, voice, expression through the deaf lens? Not how do I make an exception to deafness by trying to make it, trying to accommodate deafness so that you can be more like hearing people or be included in the hearing world. What
Mhm.
is the deaf world in in its own kind of imagistic sense, just like your father was saying? I'm not missing anything. Like my
Mm.
experience is full and whole, and I wouldn't do it any other way. So, what is art for art's sake through a deaf lens rather than trying to include or trying to bridge the gap as if there were a gap if you're not hearing what hearing people are hearing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. What I'm hearing is what is their point of view? Like,
Yeah.
what is their point of view?
Hmm.
What is their point of view? It would take more inquiry, you
Hmm.
know? And maybe I haven't even done that myself. To inquire and have, I have deaf friends now. My mother had a lot of younger friends, so they are, you know, probably my age or a little older that I can have these conversations.
Hmm.
And maybe this will open up for me, you know, get on video and talk to them about their deaf experience more deeply. Like the journey's not over here. And um they have their own perspective, their own honoring, their own viewpoints. They don't feel totally, you know, in the hearing world, but they operate in the hearing world. So
Right.
their community is needing to be very strong and really solid for them. Mm.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you or that we haven't explored that you want to be asked or want to say or speak to?
Mm. Well, I think we spoke about, you know, growing up, some of the burdens and some of the uniqueness of growing up with deaf parents. And I think I wanted to say that I felt different growing up, but it was my normal, it was my normal. And then how did I learn language was through family or school. And I didn't have people read to me, like maybe hearing people read to their children. And sometimes I see still, out in the world, parents communicating to little kids every detail of an experience. Like, what do you want? Color do you want? What flavor do you want? Like, this is what we're doing. And I thought, wow, that is such a unique experience. I did not experience that at all. It was more spatial, it was just more almost freeing. I didn't have to have somebody tell me everything that's logical, so it was actually very freeing. And so it was a different experience. And I want to just mention that because that whole grounded thing of everything being so logical doesn't happen in the hearing, I mean, in the deaf world. It's what feels more creative in a way. But for them not to hear, they have to rely a lot on intuitiveness, other people speaking their language and supporting their culture. And that's why I really hold in high regard the deaf culture. I think what they have gone through is not easy. I don't know how I would really handle, being deaf. I rely so much on hearing and learning in a certain regard. So I just find them very courageous and really beautiful people, and I have a lot of empathy for the deaf culture.
Hmm.
Mm.
I know you mentioned, and you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I did want to invite just because you mentioned that your mother recently passed. And is there anything that you want to say just to honor her or um, her experience or what she shared or instilled in you? Or is there anything sort of that you would like
Yeah,
to say about that?
yeah, I would. I mean, my mother was a very strong woman, very bold. She had a very kind of domineering father, but also a protector, and provider. And she was super courageous. Like my mother took me on trips with her when we were young kids. We drove in blue Pontiac station wagon from New Jersey to California to Tijuana with her 8 millimeter camera, taking pictures and directing us all along the way with my father. This was in the 60s. I mean, courageous, just like beautifully courageous. Not many of my friends' parents did that.
Mm.
Like we traveled, we had, experiences, and so I found her so courageous. I did idolize her. We idolized her a lot. We did, but uh I honor her just by if I can be as courageous and
Mm.
think of how she did raise a family, traveled different countries, skied, loved parties and communities, and she was super courageous. If I can just be a little bit more courageous like she was, I think I would do okay. So, yeah, I think that I kind of blend that courageousness with her optimism, and her deafness was a real beacon of light for me.
Mm.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Thank you.
Thank
Is
you
there
for
anything
asking.
else you want to say before we close our conversation today?
Um, no, Soha, I think this was a beautiful journey. I think you're doing extraordinary work, and
Mm.
I thank you for opening up the lens, into the deaf culture in the world. I hope we honored it. We gave it really a lot of grace, and her listening to my story. And this is important for me to share my story as well in all aspects. And from the organicness to the evolution of the culture's language, and how I think I'm going to even gave me some ideas to do something creative, and be more reflective as well, in what I present, to
I
blend both
love that.
cultures. Yeah, yeah, thank
Thank you
you.
so much for your grace and your time, for being with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.